we think that the trauma was quite grateful. I'm from Batu Pahat, and although I was far from Chao Keng and all these areas where the worst of the troubles were, in Batu Pahat I could feel it. I could feel the trauma. I could feel the trauma as someday I was the end of my teenage life. I was in my going to be 19, and so teenage hormones were running, amok. And what I felt at the time was that we'd been to primary school, we'd been to secondary school, we'd been through our lives with all our Malays, Indians, and Chinese friends, etc. That this was something that was going to destroy all that ethnic relations. I could feel it, and then the emergency, the fact that the big blackout in the newspapers, in the mass media as well. The trauma could be felt. But last weekend, because for the first time, we are doing a lot of things. This guy went back to Rec Cinema for the first time. But some of these people were going to the cemetery where their families were buried for the first time. Can you imagine that? And there was one person whose family, 8 members of their family, they were locked upstairs, and the house was burned, and they died more from the smoke than from parang or anything like that. So he jumped from upstairs down to the monsoon drain below, and he survived. But 8 of his family and siblings died. So this guy is gone to Sungai Buloh for the first time. So the trauma, we think that the trauma for us, me, Batu Pahat, was bad enough. You could feel it. But for these people, the victims and their families, the trauma is really shocking. And this film was interesting because there were other aspects of the film which showed that the families of these victims ended up as they're too afraid to go to Sungai Buloh cemetery to pray to their ancestors. Chinese like myself, ancestor worshippers. So anybody dies, you go to pay your respects at Qingming or some other time. So in many of these families, it's the women. It was the women that came out. The men had decided that they were going to forget about the incident. So the scare, the fright, the terror is not something that we feel. The families themselves, all these years, have not found the kind of motivation or the courage to go and visit their graves of their ancestors, their families. So I'm just to share that trauma, which is more than. And during the events of the last weekend, somebody was cheering, had seen somebody being slashed as he turned around, and that night was the first time he had told anybody, and he said that experience was something that he never forgot. So just share the.
Evening, everybody. This is such a difficult, sensitive subject. I thought I would take my time, write something out, something that's measured and composed, because it's a subject where you can easily get emotional about, and sometimes, when you're spontaneous and emotional, you end up giving the wrong message. So this is what I've put together. Now, most Malaysians of my generation have memories of May 13th, and that's a fact. Now, on that darkest day in our history, as we know, violence broke out in KL, spread to other parts of the country. Now, the human and material casualty, hundreds, perhaps thousands of lives lost and shattered, houses burned, cars burned, property looted, and so on, is actually only a very small part of its cost to the nation. Also lost was our country's sense of innocence and harmony, and the consequential damage to racial relationships and social cohesion. Now, I've written a little bit about it in the introduction to my book. May 13th not only scarred our national psyche to the core, but it has, for me, it recurs frequently in my dreams and my nightmares. Tonight is the first time that I'm publicly speaking about my memories of that days of shame and infamy. So thanks to the organizers for putting it together. When May 13th took place, I was a graduate student. I'd come back from the ANU. I was doing field work in Malaysia in the archives. I'd rented a house in PJ Section 5 of Jalan Gasing, very close to Raju, famous banana leaf place, and also very close to Kampong Kerinci. And you know, the days before May the 13th, I was doing quite a bit of work for Dr. Tan Chi Kun. I was helping write political tracts and political cartoons with old friend who's not here, Justin Vaz, but he worked in ITM in Mara. And lots of days of memories of Chikun sitting, you know, on a chair in my place, chewing kacang. His kacang was his favorite dessert, and talking about how they were going to try to win the elections and bring down the, at that time already corrupt to the core, alliance government. He didn't indicate any inkling that there was going to be trouble. Well, on the night of 13th May, many nights I would take my wife, who was with me, out in our Honda Cup to eat supper across in University Malaya or at Satellite. Is it still called Satellite?
It's still open.
It's open. And very close to the Federal Highway. That night we stayed back, and what we heard were the sound of drums beating very, very loudly, and they must have been coming across from Kampung Kerinci. And gunshots, and a lot of smoke, and a burnt smell around our area. And of course, you know, the TV and news came out that riots had broken out, and we stayed back. And those memories of drums beating, they are accentuated because the drums beat for close to a month. I think, you know, all through May and all through June. In the evening, late in the night, in the early morning. And because we are so close to Kampung Kerinci, we never knew whether there was going to be a crossing over of the violence. The other memory is of stories, of rumors. You know, there was no WhatsApp at that time, no social media, so it was just word of mouth. And of course, with word of mouth, there's also a lot of exaggeration and hyperbole and so on. But it was something that you had to listen to and pay attention to. The third memory is when we learned that a lot of the killings were along Federal Highway, of cars, motorcycles being stopped. You know, there was this reflex action that anytime you saw traffic backed up along the highway, you just turn back. And this continued for months and months after that, just in case. What other memories? Let's see, traffic backup, rumors. Oh yes, after two and a half weeks or so, I went back to work do my work in the National Archives, PJ, just across from the new town. It's shifted, I think now. It was close to the Shah Motel, swimming pool. That's the old PJ. And you know, the PJ National Archives was mainly staffed by Malay officers. The director at that was Zakia Hanum, a very nice lady. And I remember 3 weeks, a month after that fateful incident, the staff going off very early. You'll see suddenly, you know, the Malay staff all leave their positions, and of course you had to take the hint. You had to go back as quickly as possible. So the dreams and nightmares came back not so long ago. I just come back from the World Bank, 2005. We were in Malacca. I have a little place in Malacca. And one evening, 4 o'clock in the morning, big bang on the door. And suddenly there was this crashing sound against the door. Fortunately, we had our bedroom door jammed with the cupboard doors which were pulled to the side. And behind the door were 3, I think they must have been Indonesians. They had cutters, not firearms, they had cutters, and they were trying to hack away the door and pushing in the door. And I was pushing back and yelling like crazy. And fortunately, after back and forth, for what seemed like an eternity, they left. I know that's not related to May the 13th, but you know, that's brought back this nightmares once again. Now the lessons from May 13th, you know, clearly the NOC report, which came out so soon, you know, after the riots, are incomplete. They are politically skewed. They are racially distorted. They've got many unanswered questions. So what's missing is a truthful, honest inquiry driven by a mission of justice and reconciliation. But, you know, that's one more thing. Most, if not all, Malay friends don't want to talk about it with me. It's difficult to get them to discuss this. There's much to learn about what happened from all sides of the racial divide. Why did it happen? When did it happen? How did it happen? Who participated? What was the response? What was Harun and UMNO's roles? What did Harun say at the rally? What was the role of the Communists or Gerakan, of the Labour Party, of the DAP? To what extent was it planned as a coup to topple Tengku, the Prime Minister, and to replace him with Tun Razak? You know, everyone has his or her own version of the long fuse and the short fuse. Dr. Mahathir himself has his own version. I don't know whether you guys have read it. He said to Tengku, I quote, "You yourself told me that you have prevented a riot not by commuting the death sentence of the 11 subversive Chinese. In truth, this very action sparked the riots of 13 May, which resulted in the deaths of many, many more. Your give and take policy gives the Chinese everything they ask for. The climax was the commuting of the death sentence, which made the majority of the Malays angry. The Chinese, on the other hand, regarded you and the alliance government as cowards and weaklings who could be pushed around. That was why the Chinese and the Indians behaved outrageously towards the Malays." So, that's the fuse according to Dr. Mahathir. How many were killed? Why have the instigators and perpetrators of what amounts to mass murder been permitted to get away so easily is a question that we need to keep putting out. In any country, perhaps, there would be minimally a truth and reconciliation effort, but not in Malaysia. Why? I think that's the question we need to ask. Why is not difficult to answer. It is UMNO's trump card. Chris brandishing claims of bathing the nation in blood in defense of race and religion, running amok, the questioning of Ketuanan Melayu disallowed, emphasizing the limits of intemperate statements. These threats drawing on May 13 continue today in the social and some print media, and it's a staple output of UMNO cyber troopers out to destabilize. It's not only the staple output of cyber troopers, it's also that of politicians. According to Zainon Ahmad in his article in The Sun, you can Google it, The Tragedy of May 13, 1969, I quote, "While it is a dark blot in the country's history, Malaysians, young and old, will never be allowed to forget May 13. Mostly it is used to scare people away from public discussions and debate on such subjects as citizenship, education, culture, and religion. We are constantly reminded of the incident so that we will refrain from questioning the regime in power, from saying things about it or doing things that may be construed as undermining their definition of harmony and unity." I think Zainon wrote this in 2009. 1 year later, there was a planned Melayu Bangkit rally to commemorate, or perhaps to celebrate, maybe the more apt term to use. The keynote speaker, this Bangkit rally was to be held in Terengganu, was to be Dr. Mahathir, who said, "I wanted to go to the May 13 function not to raise racial issues. My aim was to say to all these people why it is important not to forget the past. People," he said, "should understand history in order not to repeat the mistakes of the past." Of course, he means people need to be reminded of his sense of history, his definition of history. The proposed rally did not take place. I think it was not the authorities didn't give the permit, and the reports are that the cancellation was because of the Prime Minister at that time, Najib. But several years later, Najib opened the UMNO General Assembly in November 2014 by screening slides of the May 13 racial riots and communist attacks in Malaya, in a reminder to UMNO members of the dangers of discord amongst the Malays. Explicitly linking the events of May 13 to the Malay and his own position under threat, he noted, I quote, "Everything that we see today didn't come easily on their own. Actually, the ups and downs of Malaysia's journey were full of episodes and events." Now, his was a not so subtle message, which seemed to indicate that the bloodbath of May 13th was the starting point of UMNO and Malay dominance. At that same meeting, Khairi Jamaluddin, UMNO Youth Chief, urged Malays to rise and defend themselves from the onslaught of insults and challenges to their special position, declaring that the country's predominant ethnic group had been patient enough. And earlier, UMNO Deputy President Muhyiddin reportedly warned that Malaysia could see another May 13th incident if no efforts were made to preserve inter-ethnic harmony, especially when Malays and Muslims continue to be insulted. Muhyiddin later clarified that he was not making any threats, but reminding about the country's race relations. Now, the bottom line warning, and this is very consistent and it will continue. Don't push the Malays, or there'll be another May 13th. Now, on 14th May, the Home Affairs Minister in the government, responding to a call to declassify documents, Soong, emphasized that Pakatan had promised to be fair and to handle any issues by taking into consideration the interests of the people for the sake of peace and harmony. And he says there's no sense digging up old stories. I don't know whether there's any special branch guy on scholarship here. An important lesson is what we are doing now and in the future, he said. Now, perhaps the past and the truth does not matter in Malaysia. And what happened on May 13th will remain forever locked in the politically and racially skewed, expurgated report of the NOC with its many unsupported assertions. But what's, to me, especially troubling as I recount these memories, is the way in which a day of infamy and shame has been transformed into a day to signify Malay power and Malay dominance. But I want to end on an optimistic note. You know, besides the instigators, the perpetrators of mass murder and arson and violence, there are examples of responses which rose above racial sentiments, of compassion, courage, of concern for victims on both sides of the racial divide by neighbors, members of the police and army. There were rogue elements also, especially in the Malay regiment, of good Samaritans, nurses, doctors that serve as a testimony to the basically peaceful character of our people. Now, the latter and their actions of humanitarianism, transcending race, need to be recorded, need to be recognized in the hope that such unifying forces will emerge if and when the next round of racially instigated violence and mayhem happens in our country. Thank you.
First of all, I'm not a historian. Second of all, I have worked on May 13th. Third of all, I'm not going to talk about May 13th. Fourth of all, in answer to you, I think we are supposed to begin with personal memories of May 13th. And I have to confess that I have very little. I was in Singapore when it happened. I had grown up in Singapore. And somehow, I was terribly worried about my family, who was still in KL. But I was in Singapore and trying to remember now what my memory, my emotions were at that time. I was obviously worried about my family. But I think I certainly do not have the kind of immediate raw emotions that Teck and Soong spoke about. I think that says something about engagement and memory as well. Just the fact of being outside meant that it did not affect me to the same degree as it did to me, as it did to people who lost 8 members of their family in an incomprehensible night. And I think that maybe that lets make us also realize, or it has helped me to realize, not the question of May 13th itself. It seems to me that we have to recognize that memories are divergent, and they depend a lot also on whether it is based on an immediate experience or on a mediated experience. Now, when I was asked if I could participate on this panel by a young man, I asked his age, and he said he's only 22. That was when I thought, well, I think we have a responsibility to come and speak to those age 22 who never went, this is the 50th anniversary of May 13th. 22-year-old kids were not alive when it happened, and yet they have memories of it. Like Netusha, you said, you have memories of May 13th. These memories are not immediate, they are transmitted through collective memories, through family memories, through what is said in the family or what is not said in the family. I was very touched by by the documentary, and what was striking about the document, among other things, was that people, I think all 4 of them, had not returned to the site of memory. Probably they haven't talked about it. It was something that we repressed. You talk about memory repression. So memory is immediate, and if it is not, it is mediated. And then the question arises, if it is mediated, who are the mediators and what are the mediators? I think when we talk about memory, that's important to bear in mind. The second thing that strikes me really tonight is that I think we are at a very important moment in our national history, the kind of national history that Teck was talking about. And that is, it seems to me that for the first time, we are collectively talking about May 13th. Teck shared his memories for the first time. Soong was telling us how throughout the entire week, there were events about May 13th. Now, this may have happened before. I think perhaps to a large extent it was Soong's research on May 13th that brought this issue into the open. But I think the fact that we have something like this going on tonight, the fact that people are talking openly about their individual personal memories, as well as sharing memories about May 13th, the fact that a young generation who did not experience May 13th personally are interested in it and are making documentaries about it, I think shows that we are really at a critical and important transformative moment in our national history. And that is perhaps something that we also should be giving our academic as well as activist attention to. What does it mean that we have now reached in our national history, in our shared national history, a time, a place where we feel across generations that we can talk about this obviously most traumatic event in our country's history. I think I'll stop at this point. It's not the presentation I was going to make, but
We say that. But when you find out, for example, what happened in Wong recently, near the Thai border, when people who have been trafficked are found buried in mass graves near the Thai border, what do? We exhume the bodies to find out who they were, how they died, etc. That's the least you can do to a human being. So, how many people died and who they were in May 13, we still don't know. I'll show you some pictures from Sungai Buloh Cemetery later on, and you get an idea what the situation is like. And when we're talking about reconciliation, I raise it in the newspapers and people say, why do you dig up old bones and why, but reconciliation, as has happened in South Africa, as has happened in Rwanda and other places, it's about a restorative justice. Nobody needs to be afraid that there's retribution, you're going to be charged, or etc. There's nothing of that kind that happens in a reconciliation commission. And the idea is to try and heal relations. Like I mentioned last weekend at the Chinese Assembly Hall, the victims and their families, the families of the victims, are still so traumatized that they need to be healed. And the important thing is the acknowledgement between the victims, their families, and the perpetrators. That is what happened in South Africa. It's very, very deep, very moving, and that has to be done before we can move on. I'll bring forward to other things that need to be said. My book that I did in 2007, and what did the documents show? I had to go to London to find out what these documents were, because for the first time, the secrets are released after 30 years. I remember asking Pak Chong, Pak Chong can sponsor me to go and do some research on this. He said, oh, where got money? So anyway, I found my own money, and I flew to London, rented a room for about 2 weeks and dug up all the secrets from there. And of course, as many in the community knows, it's not a spontaneous right. I like the way that people talk about the Malays, inverted commas, and the Chinese, inverted commas. There's no such thing. We got on with our Malay and Indian neighbors ever since we were kids. And about whether the CPM was involved, or the Labour Party or the DAP was involved, from the documents, I found that I didn't have to do very much, because from the Tunku's and the NOC's own retractions, they had to retract what they said about it was the CPM was involved, and it was the opposition parties at the time. Many people, foreign journalists, people in the High Commissions, not just in Britain, not just the British High Commission, but other High Commissions had that same idea. That it was an orchestrated program, and that the security forces were not impartial. And so these are things that we sort of know. But my thesis, which I formulated when I was a 20-something, when I was doing my PhD thesis, and I was quite surprised at that time that some academics at that time were still talking about the NEP as if it was a very good thing, etc. And when in my 20-something I was doing my PhD thesis, I could see that it was an attempt by this emergent state capitalist class to take control of the country. And it was to me that it was a coup against the aristocratic class headed by the Tunku. And from the documents again, we see how Razak met with the chiefs of the army and soon after the riots broke. And the Tunku is another. The quote here is from another of my books, which I edited. I think it's published by SIRD as well. Because K. Das, one of my very dear friend K. Das, who died in 1992, was the official biographer of the Tunku. And I've got this tape that he had made with the Tunku. Kedas is Joe Kokata's father. And the family decided I was the one who would edit the book, you know. And so from the tape you can see the Tunku spilling the beans about what he thought, and you can see how bitter he was about that. So this thesis of mine, was that a new narrative? You know, some people say, oh, it's your thesis, your theory against other people's theory. But 1969, Said Zahari, there he is, Said Zahari, dear Said Zahari, was a detainee in Singapore when May 13 happened. So a political detainee sitting in a prison in Singapore could see his famous poem. We were student activists in England, and his famous poem was called Hidden Hands. He could see the hidden hands in his detention cell in Singapore. And Subki Latif, we don't hear very often of Subki Latif, no, a past academic who was at ISEAS in Singapore, and he wrote an article about this in the Southeast Asian Affairs in 1977. Same narrative, there was a coup against the Tunku. And like I said, it was my thesis was submitted in 1981, but my thesis had been formulated in the 70s when I was in my 20s. The multicultural agenda, we see that formulated in the first, just a week after May 13. You know. So you can see that coup and that multiculturalism as an ideology. You know, today we see all these Marxist ideologies and theories all over the place. You know. And in your universities and all, you talk like, oh, there's the thesis, the revolutionary thesis by what's his name? Prison Notebooks. Ramsey, yeah. Ramsey talks about ideology, positive ideology, ideological state apparatuses. And multiculturalism is an ideology of the ruling class at the time, and still is. Okay? And the multicultural agenda, believe it or not, still exists under Pakatan Harapan. And today we had it. The details of it was described by our dear education minister, why matriculation is still important, you know, etc. So after the May 13, you see the way in which the public development expenditure increased from the first Malaysia plan to the third Malaysia plan, and up to today. You know, there's no end to the largesse that's put onto the state. Would be institutions multiplied by, you know, in multiples. It's interesting this point about, because now we have a state where the police and the armed forces are more than 95% Bumiputra. But look at just the eve of May 13, in 1968. Police Division 1, Malays 45%, Chinese 32%, Indian 22%. And it's a very drastic cut in the riot squad, FRU. You know, at the time it was almost 100%, and where I was in Batu Pahat, almost 100% Chinese in the FRU. And after May 13, they all resigned because they saw what had happened in May 13. And post 1981 was Mahathir's privatization policies, when the state capitalists became private capitalists, and we saw the whole array of crony capitalism, which threatens to repeat itself today. We see the Mahathir dime Anwar rivalry in handling of today. We see how Terence Gomez writing during the time. It's very clear to see. And you look at the way after Badawi came to power, and Najib, and the way they cut out Mahathir from the mega projects, you know, from Putrajaya, etc. And that was the beginning of Mahathir's backlash. So it's not so much Mahathir is such an anti-kleptocrat. You know, it's a whole background of all that kind of cronyism. And it's interesting that this happened in 1987 when I was a victim of Mahathir's Operation Lala. The Tunku himself says that for the Prime Minister to repeat the story of the violence of May 13, because he was always using it during the time. I remember I stood for election in 1990.
And on television before the general election of the time was all about May 13. Newspapers were carrying out adverts about May 13, even including Chinese papers. I remember our election committee in PJ, I was staying in PJ. We burned one particular Chinese newspaper at that time because they were carrying these awful advertisements, and they apologized the next day. So this is what the Prime Minister was repeating the story of the violence of May 30 as a warning of what would happen if the government had not taken appropriate action. It's like telling ghost stories to our children, you know, and the Tunku said this should not happen because it shows us to be an immature community. And the important thing is that the status quo changed. The so-called social contract changed. The social contract as we know it has to be 1957, hasn't it? It couldn't be any other. Independence was 1957. But what happened after May 13 was the Amendment 8A to the Article 153 of the. So can we call that the new social contract? But when you hear any mention about the social contract today, nobody talks about a shifted social contract. It is no longer the same. 8A brings in the new quota system. But if you read a critique of the quota system by a dean of the law faculty in Singapore, I read it in the 90s, and then in the collection by Trinidada in 4 Tun Sofian, this guy called Sivadurai, the Dean of Faculty of Law in Singapore. He says that if at that time, the 90s, before UITM and all that, he challenged the government to its enrollment policies in Mara, you show that it is contra to the 8A amendment. So this is the new social contract. 1986, when Dola Ahmad talked about Ketuanan Melayu. So these are the timelines of the Bumiputrai's ideology. You didn't have Ketuanan Melayu before 1986 because it was only when Dola Ahmad mentioned it in a seminar in Singapore that you had Ketuanan Melayu. Now it become like part of our parlance, you know. You didn't have Bumiputra as a concept in the federal constitution. Now it's mentioned as if, you know, even Pakatan Harapan is talking about Bumiputra agenda. It is not in the federal constitution. So we have a condition to the absolute extreme in UITM, where you have apartheid policy. Not one single non-Bumiputra can enter UITM. You know? What do our constitutional lawyers say about that? I haven't seen any constitutional lawyers stand up in the newspapers and tell us whether this fits in with the Article 153, including A amendment. Nobody mentions that. How is that? Okay? So let that be a challenge to all our lawyers. How many and who died? Peggy mentioned the National Operations Council. If they had, after May 13 sort of got more normalized in July. And that was the time when you saw the police acting really professionally. The police are one of the best, not only in Southeast Asia, but in the world. The Americans came to learn from Malaysia about the anti-Vietnam war, you know. You came to get some advice. And you saw how the police broke up the Kesas Highway demonstration. Remember the Kesas Highway demonstration? In minutes, they could scatter the thousands of people in the Kesas Highway. But it took them May 13 right up to July, May, June, July, 2 months. Just like it took 1 week to get Kampong Medan under control. 1 week in that small Kampong Medan was used to be a Mandamai constituency in Petaling Jaya. 1 week to keep order in Kampong Medan. That's unforgivable. Okay? So if the NOC had held an open inquiry at the time, because the best source of your information would be the hospitals. I got into a debate with the director of Tangda Putra. Can't remember what the name is now.
Naomi Baba.
That's right. And I told her that I had written, I think somewhere, that my brother-in-law was a professor of medicine at the University Hospital in MU. My brother was a medical student at MU, and a neighbor of mine was also a medical student at MU, helping with the corpses. Do you think that's not a good enough eyewitness account of what happened to show that corpses had been tarred to hide their ethnicity? Is that not a good enough reason for the NOC to investigate? So if those things, if the NOC had held an open inquiry months or even a year or even 5 years after May 13, I understand that after 10 years, the records in the hospitals are destroyed. So this is 50 years after, I'm not very hopeful about it. But you had 10 years or 5 years or 1 year to come up with an open inquiry of who. I'm more interested in how many and who died. To me, that's the most important thing. We'll look at the cemetery later on. Names of victims, how many died, how many were injured. And I mentioned earlier on about Wong Ke. It's interesting that Ke Lian in Chinese is pitiful and sorrowful. You have a place called Wong Ke. What did we do? We assume. We want to find out the cause of death. Why were the bodies tarred in May 13? Okay, this is one of the tombstones at Sungai Buloh Cemetery. Quite a few of them are just got unidentified Chinese. There's also an unidentified Malay, and also even an unidentified Indian. And this film that was made, this poignant film this filmmaker had made, this person, this girl had been looking for her brother for years at the cemetery. And somebody suggested to her, why don't you just adopt one of these unidentified Chinese? And that's what this film was about. Very, very, very stark kind of film this film was. And she's writing the name of her brother on one of these unidentified Chinese. And at the bottom is by courtesy of the government of Malaysia. Everyone. Okay. So look at the graves. What do they tell you? Every Qingming festival I go to visit the graves of my ancestors. This is not a Chinese grave. Every grave in a Chinese cemetery would have a mound where the body is. And it's very clear from this that this is a mass grave. And the tombstones were just put on just in order to give some kind of order of it. And the other thing is, you count the number of tombstones here, and there's something like 108 tombstones.
Okay.
And what is the official figure for the number of people died, who were killed? 196. So what has happened to the rest? What has happened to about 90 bodies? Are there other mass graves besides Sungai Buloh? Where are they? Is this not a legitimate question? We are wondering about what's happened to the bodies in Wong Ke. And these are Malaysians, people who could be living in the middle of Kuala Lumpur. Malaysians, isn't it legitimate to ask them where the rest of the bodies are? So I think, the British declassified their secrets after 30 years. Is it not fair to ask the Malaysian government, under the new Malaysia government of Pakatan Harapan, to declassify our May 13 secrets? And our special branch used to boast to me when I was a detainee in Operation Lalang that you think you academics are very clever with your university libraries. He said, our library is anytime better than yours. And he's right. He is right. The special branch archives are anytime better than any of our libraries.
They got all the banned books there.
So if we can let academics, journalists, historians have a look at these papers and let them make their own decisions. How did the violence start, etc.? Who were the hidden hands? And what happened to the Freedom of Information Act? I can ask questions under the Freedom of Information Act on May 13, I would love to ask many of these questions, but what's happened to the Freedom of Information Act? As we wait. So, recent controversies that are not completely divorced from May 13. Ratifying the International Convention on the Eradication of Racial Discrimination. When the issue came up, everybody was talking about how the sovereignty of the rulers were affected, etc. But we're talking about, is this new government, new Malaysian government, prepared to accept racial discrimination in UITM and anywhere else, including if there's racial discrimination in the Chinese enterprises? If a Chinese business discriminates against other races, they deserve to be brought to an equality or race relations commission. If Malaysians of any color discriminates against Africans and say that they will not rent their rooms to Africans, they deserve to be brought before an equality and human rights commission, and so forth, okay? And after what happened at May 13, after what happened at Kampong Medan in 2001, after what happened at the Seafield Temple, we would ask the government to establish a rapid deployment force of multi-ethnic police task force to be sent to any so-called racial flashpoint. If Seafield happens again, it is not the normal police that goes there, but this special rapid deployment force goes there, which is multi-ethnic, so that we have none of that kind of nonsense that will happen again. Okay? And the recent controversy over the International Criminal Court. Again, it is about the sovereignty of the rulers. You know, just absolute nonsense. What happens, what is important there is anything like May 13 happens again, anything like Kampong Medan happens again, whoever is the rogue behind those killings can be brought to the International Criminal Court. And that is why we must ratify the Rome Statute. A monument, I think a monument is important. You know, recently in Kedah, the Kedah government wanted to build a monument for the three Japanese heroes from World War II. You know, are the Japanese heroes in World War II in this country? You need to look at history. Dr. Ghee will probably tell you about that history. Japan, as opposed to Germany, hasn't done enough for reconciliation. The Germans have done a much better job of what they did during the Holocaust, etc. And at least to honor the victims of May 13 with a decent burial, you know, and the condemnation of that kind of, okay. And the last of all, last year I went to visit the Basque country. The Basque people are quite a very brave people, you know, and during the Spanish Civil War, they were bombed. Guernica was bombed by the fascist forces of Franco with the German Luftwaffe. And during that time, there were many anti-fascist writers. I don't know if there are any up there. But these anti-fascist writers included George Orwell, Ernest Hemingway, Arthur Koestler, Andre Malraux, Emma Goldman, Locke, Pablo Neruda. You know, these are not just writers. You know, they didn't just write in support of the people who were fighting the fascists. Some of them volunteered in those fascists. So our writers today, our young writers today, how far we're prepared to go in our anti-fascist struggles. You know? Okay, I think that's about all. This is just in reply to many people since the 50th anniversary of May 13, when they say, why dig up old stuff, you know? Why dig up old stuff? And this quote by Santayana, I think, is a very good way to reply to them. You know, we do not confront the past. How can you move into the future? You know, that we're supposed to be marching into Vision 2020. And there's one phrase in Vision 2020 I never forget. You want to create a society that is at peace with itself. When I was in Parliament in 1990, I discovered that it was borrowed from the Conservative Party's manifesto. But I thought that it was good enough phrase. It is good enough phrase to justify plagiarism.
The correct version is the nation that's pissing itself.
irreverent academics like that. Anyway, I think I'll end here. Thank you.